Brave New World. Chapter 1. A squat grey building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance the words Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, and in a shield, the World State's motto: Community, Identity, Stability. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north, cold for all the summer beyond the panes. For all the tropical heat of the room itself, a harsh, thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some pallid shape of academic goose flesh, but finding only the glass and nickel and bleakly shining porcelain of a laboratory. Winteriness responded to winteriness. The overalls of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale, corpse-coloured rubber. The light was frozen, dead, a ghost. Only from the yellow barrels of the microscopes did it borrow a certain rich and living substance, lying along the polished tubes like butter, streak after luscious streak in long recession down the work tables. "And this," said the director, opening the door, "is the fertilizing room." Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were plunged as the director of hatcheries and conditioning entered the room. In the scarcely breathing silence, the absent-minded, soliloquizing hum or whistle of absorbed concentration. A troop of newly arrived students, very young, pink and callow, followed nervously, rather abjectly, at the director's heels. Each of them carried a notebook in which, whenever the great man spoke, he desperately scribbled, straight from the horse's mouth. It was a rare privilege. The DHC for Central London always made a point of personally conducting his new students round the various departments. "Just to give you a general idea," he would explain to them, for of course some sort of general idea they must have if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one, if they were to be good and happy members of society, as possible. For particulars, as everyone knows, make for virtue and happiness. Generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Not philosophers, but fret-sawyers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society. "Tomorrow," he would add, smiling at them with a slightly menacing geniality, "you'll be settling down to serious work. You won't have time for generalities. Meanwhile, it was a privilege. Straight from the horse's mouth and into the notebook. The boys scribbled like mad. Tall and rather thin, but upright, the director advanced into the room. He had a long chin and big, rather prominent teeth, just covered, when he was not talking, by his full, floridly covered lips. Old, young, 30, 50, 55, it was hard to say, and anyhow the question didn't arise. In this year of stability, AF 632, it didn't occur to you to ask it. "I shall begin at the beginning," said the DHC, and the more zealous students recorded his intention in their notebooks. "Begin at the beginning. These," he waved his hand, "are the incubators." And opening an insulated door, he showed them racks upon racks of numbered test tubes. "The week's supply of ova, kept," he explained, "at blood heat, whereas the male gametes," and here he opened another door, "they have to be kept at 35 instead of 37. Full blood heat sterilizes. Rams wrapped in thermogene beget no lambs." Still leaning against the incubators, he gave them, while the pencils scurried illegibly across the pages, a brief description of the modern fertilizing process. Spoke first, of course, of its surgical introduction. The operation undergone voluntarily for the good of society. Not to mention the fact that it carries a bonus amounting to 6 months' salary. Continued with some account of the technique for preserving the excised ovary alive and actively developing. Passed on to a consideration of optimum temperature, salinity, viscosity. Referred to the liquor in which the detached and ripened eggs were kept. And, leading his charges to the work tables, actually showed them how the liquor was drawn off from the test tubes. How it was let out drop by drop onto the specially warmed slides of the microscopes. How the eggs which it contained were inspected for abnormalities, counted, and transferred to a porous receptacle. How, and he now took them to watch the operation, this receptacle was immersed in a warm bouillon containing free-swimming spermatozoa at a minimum concentration of 100,000 per cubic centimetre, he insisted, and how, after 10 minutes, the container was lifted out of the liquor and its contents re-examined. How, if any of the eggs remained unfertilized, it was again immersed, and, if necessary, yet again. How the fertilized ova went back to the incubators, where the alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, while the gammas, deltas, and epsilons were brought out again, after only 36 hours, to undergo Bokanovsky's process. Bokanovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebooks. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult. Normality. But a Bokanovskified egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide. From 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow where only 1 grew before. Progress. Essentially, the DHC concluded, Bokanovskification consists of a series of arrests of development. We check the normal growth, and, paradoxically enough, the egg responds to budding. Responds by budding. The pencils were busy. He pointed. On a very slowly moving band, a rackful of test tubes was entering a large metal box. Another rackful was emerging. Machinery faintly purred. It took 8 minutes for the tubes to go through, he told them. 8 minutes of hard X-rays being about as much as an egg can stand. A few died. Of the rest, the least susceptible divided into 2. Most put out 4 buds, some 8. All were returned to the incubators, where the buds began to develop, then, after 2 days, were suddenly chilled, and checked. 2, 4, 8. The buds in their turn budded, and having budded were dosed almost to death with alcohol, consequently burgeoning again and having budded, bud out of bud were thereafter, further arrest being generally fatal, left to develop in peace. By which time the original egg was in a fair way to becoming anything from 8 to 96 embryos. A prodigious improvement, you'll agree, on nature. Identical twins, but not in piddling 2s and 3s as in the old viparious days, when an egg would sometimes accidentally divide. Actually by dozens, by scores at a time. Scores! The director repeated and flung out his arms as though he were distributing largesse. Scores! But one of the students was fool enough to ask where the advantage lay. My good boy! The director wheeled sharply around on him. Can't you see? Can't you see? He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. Bokanovsky's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. Major instruments of social stability. Standard men and women in uniform batches. The whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Bokanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tremulous with enthusiasm. You really know where you are. For the first time in history. He quoted the planetary motto. Community, identity, stability. Grand words. If we could Bokanovskify indefinitely, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons, millions of identical twins. The principle of mass production at last applied to biology. But alas, the director shook his head. We can't Bokanovskify indefinitely. 96 seemed to be the limit, 72 a good average. From the same ovary and with gametes of the same male to manufacture as many batches of identical twins as possible, that was the best. Sadly, a second best that they could do, and even that was difficult. For in nature it takes 30 years for 200 eggs to reach maturity, but our business is to stabilize the population at this moment, here and now. Dribbling out twins over a quarter of a century, what would be the use of that? Obviously, no use at all. But Podsnap's technique had immensely accelerated the process of ripening. They could make sure of at least 150 mature eggs within 2 years. Fertilize and Bokanovskify. In other words, multiply by 72, and you get an average of nearly 11,000 brothers and sisters in 150 batches of identical twins, all within 2 years of the same age. And in exceptional cases, we can make one ovary yield as over 15,000 adult individuals. Beckoning to a fair-haired, ruddy young man who happened to be passing at the moment. "Mr. Foster," he called. The ruddy young man approached. "Can you tell us the record for a single ovary, Mr. Foster?" 16,012 in this centre, Mr. Foster replied without hesitation. He spoke very quickly, had a vivacious blue eye, and took an evident pleasure in quoting figures. 16,012 in 189 batches of identicals. But of course they've done much better, he rattled on, in some of the tropical centres. Singapore has often produced over 16,500, and Mombasa has actually touched the 17,000 mark. But then they had unfair advantages. You should see the way a Negro ovary responds to pituitary. It's quite astonishing, when he used to working with European material. Still, he added with a laugh, but the light of combat was in his eyes, and the lift of his chin was challenging. Still, we mean to beat them if we can. I'm working on a wonderful Delta Minus ovary at the moment, only just 18 months old. Over 12,700 children already, either decanted or in embryo, and still going strong. We'll beat them yet. That's the spirit I like, cried the director, and clapped Mr. Foster on the shoulder. Come along with us and give these boys the benefit of your expert knowledge. Mr. Foster smiled modestly. With pleasure. They went. In the bottling room, all was harmonious bustle and ordered activity. Flaps of fresh sow's peritoneum ready cut to the proper size came shooting up in little lifts from the organ store in the sub-basement. Whiz and then click. The lift hatches flew open. The bottle liner had only to reach out a hand, take the flap, insert, smooth down, and before the lined bottle had had time to travel out of reach along the endless band, whiz, click, another flap of peritoneum had shot up from the depths, ready to be slipped into yet another bottle. the next of that slow, interminable procession on the band. Next to the liners stood the matriculators. The procession advanced. One by one the eggs were transferred from their test tubes to the larger containers. Deftly the peritoneal lining was slit. The morula dropped into place. The saline solution poured in. And already the bottle had passed, and it was the turn of the labellers. Hereditary, date of fertilization, membership of Bokanovsky Group, details were transferred from test tube to bottle. No longer anonymous, but named, identified, the procession marched slowly on through an opening in the wall, slowly, on into the social predestination room. 88 cubic meters of card index, said Mr. Foster with relish as they entered, containing all the relevant information, added the director, brought up to date every morning, and coordinated every afternoon.